As autumn moves aside to make room for the winter, Idaho's wildlife begin their own transitions. Grizzly bears and black bears rumble into their own chosen dens for the winter. Sharp-tailed grouse and other upland game birds seek out the high grasses along the riverbanks for protection from blustery winds. But the elk and antelope and deer of Idaho spend the whole summer preparing against the cold and snows of winter. They've browsed the desert and high country, choosing a rich, nutritious diet that will build the fat reserves for the season to come. Soon, they will stand the test. It comes first to the high country, nature gently burying its dead. The brown, withered leaves of fall gradually disappear under a cleansing layer of white. But the season's first delicate, lacy flakes disguise the harsh bite of the Rocky Mountain winter to come. The wildlife knows. Instincts don't change. Deer and elk follow the path of 1,000 years, journeying to the more forgiving territory of lower elevations. But some winters, even these don't forgive. Nature steps in, and the weak and the crippled begin to die. Starvation is one of nature's laws, but a difficult one for man to accept.
The feeding of wildlife is just one of those things that seems like a simple solution to a problem. Animals are going to starve, let's feed them. And if we start feeding these animals, we can end up in trouble. We really have to be critical of what we're doing to tip this nature scale.
The last large-scale winter feeding program in Idaho was the winter of '88-'89. That year, Fish and Game fed about 23,000 animals. That may sound like quite a few, but actually it adds up to less than 6% of Idaho's population of deer, elk, and antelope.
Here in Idaho, we like to think this is still a wild state. Well, I'm all for keeping wildlife wild. If we start feeding them on a feedlot in the wintertime, we're concentrating these animals. We're asking for disease problems, very similar to what happened in Wyoming.
This is one of 15 feed grounds in Wyoming where elk are being vaccinated for disease.
We've got two guns that are attached together. The rifle shoots the bio bullet, and the black pistol shoots the paintball.
Got her.
It's kind of a two-step process. We mark the animal so that we can later identify that it's been vaccinated.
Wyoming got into a pattern of winter feeding in the early 1900s, and it's never stopped. Each winter, the wild elk of Wyoming come to the feed grounds for handouts, and each winter the concentration of animals spreads disease.
We're working on a program to vaccinate our elk, our feed ground elk populations for brucellosis, which is a disease, a cattle disease that our feed ground elk populations have that causes cows to abort their calves.
Wyoming's domestic cattle have been designated brucellosis-free for the last 5 years. This means that ranchers can ship their livestock anywhere in the United States without having to pay for expensive blood tests.
The reason we're involved in this program is primarily because of the concerns of transmitting brucellosis to domestic livestock.
For a state to be designated as brucellosis-free is an expensive process. It's in Wyoming's best interest to preserve this status, but feeding and vaccinating Wyoming's elk population also comes at a price. Vaccinations alone cost the U.S. Department of Agriculture over $100,000 a year. Add to that over $2 million spent on feeding by the state and federal governments, and you have a hefty price tag.
We'll be vaccinating as long as we're feeding elk.
This is exactly the scenario Idaho is trying to avoid. Since October 1990, Idaho's domestic cattle have been designated brucellosis-free. But unlike Wyoming, Idaho's elk are not harboring the disease.
At this point in time, we have not found a brucella-positive elk in Idaho, but it's waiting to happen. And if we start feeding these animals on a year-by-year basis, we can end up in trouble by acclimating those animals to come back to that area to be fed.
So what is the answer? Rancher Dave Nelson of the Idaho Cattle Association is totally opposed to feeding elk on a year-by-year basis. He feels that concentrating animals only creates disease problems. According to Fish and Game, One answer is improving wildlife's traditional winter range. Another may be to keep the population numbers down.
The hardest thing to do is to back off and let nature take its course, because people don't want to see things die. Well, that's nice that we have that ability to look at life with these nice rose-colored glasses, but it's not that way in nature.
Idaho's wildlife is one of the most precious legacies we can pass on to our children. The challenge seems to be to keep the wildlife wild.